Welcome back to the third installation of our mini-series on epistemic injustice. Now, this week we're going to talk a little bit about formal stuff. So, part of my research project is to apply methods of what is called formal epistemology, so to apply a little bit of math to these interesting philosophical questions. Now, I understand that an audio format is not the best way to learn about mathematical formula and this kind of stuff, so I'm going to try to keep it as informal as humanly possible, while still conveying some of the import of the mathematical stuff. So how does this whole thing work? So first, we start out by representing beliefs as probabilities. Probabilities you should be somewhat familiar, at least from school. So you can think about, for instance, tossing a fair coin. Your belief about if the coin is going to land heads is going to be 50% ahead of the coin toss, and the same for the coin landing on the other side. Now we can generalize this idea for things that don't look as much as stochastic processes. For instance, you could have a belief that takes the form of a probability about if it's going to rain tomorrow, or you could have believe that it has the form of a probability how likely it is that your two co-workers are still going to be together at the end of the month, or something like that, right? So we can represent any belief that is associated with some uncertainty with a probability is the idea. Now, if you're talking about testimony, we want to represent a couple of variables that we have beliefs about. We are taking the position of the audience, and we are thinking about the testimony that we might get from a particular source. So one thing that we have a belief about is some proposition of interest. So for instance, it did rain this morning. We were still asleep, so we are not quite sure about it. We have maybe some evidence, but we want to know if it actually rained, and we are asking someone else who was awake at the time if it did indeed rain in the morning. So we have some prior belief if it did rain in the morning, and we also have a second belief, that is how reliable is the source that we are talking to, right? So for instance, that could include information of how sure are we that they are actually honest about being already awake. It could include information about how honest we think they are, right? Maybe they just want to dupe us. There's all kinds of contributing information that makes the source more or less reliable, right? But in the end, we have some kind of belief if the source is reliable, and we can represent it again as a probability. Now, also, in a lot of cases, we can assume that these two beliefs are independent from each other. Now, this is in a technical sense, but it also very intuitive sense. The fact that it did rain this morning has nothing directly to do with if the person is reliable. Now, there are certain propositions that we could require testimony about where this independence assumption doesn't hold, and the situation gets a little bit more complicated, but that's not something we need to talk about today. Today we are going to live in the world where they are, prior to receiving the testimony, just independent from each other. Now there's the third variable, and that is the actual testimony, right? The person is going to say, yes, it did rain this morning, or no, it did not rain this morning. So we will have a very simple binary representation. As just binary means it can just take two values. And what is now going to happen is we are going to use a mathematical formula which is called Bayes' rule. It's a very simple formula based on conditional probabilities. You can look it up even on Wikipedia if you want to. And we use that formula to calculate new values based on the testimony that we received regarding both the proposition that it rained this morning and how reliable our source is. And now the general intuition that we have is that the more reliable the source is, the more are we going to believe after receiving a testimony in the content of the testimony, right? So if we think that the source is very reliable and we receive positive testimony to the effect that it rained this morning, we will be much more convinced that it rained this morning, and vice versa. Now, this modeling also implies that if a source gives us information that is very much out of line with our prior belief on the proposition, we will reduce our estimation of the reliability of the source. So going maybe away for a moment from the rain example, Let's say we are discussing the issue of the flat Earth, right? Very commonly known funny proposition that indeed actually the Earth is flat, and everything that we have been told about being round and a lot of other like cosmological facts is just deception. Now, I, for my part, have a very, very low degree of belief that this is actually true. And if someone is going to tell me that it is true, sincerely, I will reduce the credibility that I give to the source by a lot, right? So this is kind of the other side of the coin. A very reliable source will have a lot of influence on my degree of belief in the proposition. And at the same time, if I get very implausible testimony given my prior belief, I will reduce the credibility of the source. And that's the basic model. It's very simple, actually. Of course, I spared you the exact formal details of the application of the Bayes rule and everything, but you could do the calculations probably by yourself with the formula that you find on Wikipedia. So this is the basic model of testimony. Now, I haven't said anything about epistemic injustice, and to that I'm going to turn in a second. Chapter 2, Access Credibility. So you may or may not remember that in the first episode, when we were talking about testimonial injustice, I was briefly talking about the wrong of access credibility. The basic question here was, if I'm giving too much credibility to a particular speaker, am I also committing an immediate wrong? Going back to the original writings about epistemic injustice, there's one way that I want to put out of the way for the purpose of this discussion in which you can wrong someone by giving them too much credibility, which is that in particular, if this happens repeatedly and happens from a lot of particular audiences, that speaker may become epistemically corrupted in a certain sense. Now, that's a very abstract idea, but basically the idea is if you are always being believed, you're never being critically questioned about your testimony, you may become epistemically arrogant. You may become arrogant about your testimony. You may lose the ability to question yourself and your own beliefs. And that, of course, is someone that is also harmful to yourself. But that seems to be a rather rare case. In general, it seems to be that getting too much credit for what one is saying is generally beneficial. It might also be harmful for the person who's listening to the speaker, because they might have too high of a confidence in whatever the speaker is saying, right? But that is not, again, testimonial injustice. So the question is, if I am lending too much credibility to a particular speaker, am I immediately committing a kind of testimonial injustice? Now, the logical point to go, I believe, is to move from a dyadic interaction to an interaction with three people. Right? There's not only one audience or one speaker, but there is two speakers and one person in the audience. It could be more, the argument generalizes, but of course the easiest it is to observe with two speakers. Imagine now the following situation. Let's say I am giving 100% credibility to one speaker. I am totally confident that this person is knowledgeable and honest about the topic in question and is going to guaranteed give me the right answer. It might be a little bit unrealistic, but in theory I could do that. Now if I can do that once, I can also do it a second time. There's another speaker who is also a brilliant mind, very well informed, and very good faith speaker on the matter. And I also give them 100% credibility. Now the problem is, if now these two speakers contradict each other, then I am committed to believe a contradiction. Because I believe them both 100%, that means that I would have to adapt what they are saying. Say, for instance, going back to our basic example about did it rain this morning, I would have to believe from the first speaker, maybe saying that it did rain this morning, I would have 100% belief that it did rain this morning, and a second speaker disagreeing, saying, no, it did not actually rain this morning. I would came to believe with 100% that it did not indeed rain this morning. And of course, then I'm believing a straightforward contradiction, namely that it did and did not rain this morning. So what seems to follow from this is that there are restrictions of how much credibility I can give to one speaker and still maintain giving proper credibility to another speaker. Now, this is, of course, a very extreme case, but we can also move to partial belief, and I will stick largely with the informal argument for this. So now imagine that we're not giving 100% credibility, but let's assume that we have two speakers and we give them both some kind of limited large amount of credibility. Now here, to see the problem of excess credibility, let's assume we get testimony from these two speakers. Everything so far is fine, but now a third speaker enters the situation. Now this third speaker, if we give any weight to what they have to say, will diminish the effect in a way that the first two speakers had on what we said. And that is generally totally fine, right? If we are asking additional sources about a particular question, then our belief about the question will be some kind of combination weighted by the credibility of the sources. And of course, if we have additional sources, that weight will be split further. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That is totally normal. It doesn't mean any kind of unfair discounting of credibility. However, if we gave too much credibility to one of our first two speakers, say, then now, if we give proper credibility in numerical terms to our third speaker that is added to the situation, we will give them not enough credit, because their effect, relatively speaking, will be too small compared to the first speaker. It will not be what they deserved. Even if we looked at the third speaker in isolation, we gave them the proper amount of credibility, right? We gave them, say, it is like, to put it like a little artificially in actual numbers, let's say there were like 70% chance that that person gives a proper gives us proper testimony, right? That they are both competent and honest to such a degree that with 70% probability they will be telling us the truth. But if I gave too much credibility to another speaker before, the relative credibility that this new speaker will receive, even though it is on this like direct numerical account correct, will be too small. Now, we can look at this from kind of another angle, right? We can look at, we assign a certain kind of credibility, a certain number to every speaker, and that number can be appropriate to their competence and honesty, or it can be too large or it can be too small. And that would be a kind of direct testimonial injustice if it is too small. And in a direct sense, everything would be okay if it is too large or appropriate, you could say. But we can also look at it from the resulting beliefs point of view. Right? I will have, in the end of receiving all these kinds of testimonies, a certain degree of belief that it did rain this morning. And that degree of belief should align with proper credibility assignments. Because here it now becomes equivalent to give too much to one speaker and not enough to another. And in that sense, we can say that when I am handing out excess credibility to a speaker, I am committing myself implicitly to not handing out enough credibility to another speaker. Now, in a way, we have two interpretations of our general notion of credibility here, and we see that they clash with each other. And one of them would be to just look at a single speaker, assess their competence and honesty, and then make a assessment of their credibility, and it could be too high, it could be too low, but that's it. It's just a number, the probability, how likely we think it is that they are providing us with a correct report. The second one, we could say, is an indirect or mediate way of looking at credibility, where we are wondering, well, how much impact is a given report going to have relative to other given reports on the belief that I'm going to have in the end. And in that case, it is significant that I'm handing out excess credibility to another. And that is the sense in which a testimonial injustice is committed directly by handing out excess credibility to one particular speaker. This is it for this episode. Thank you for listening. On the next episode, I am going to talk about the agency of the subject of epistemic injustice and what they can do about their